Race fans, it's time to buckle in and listen to the fastest hour in racing radio. Your driver is a multi-time NASCAR winner and Hall of Famer Mark Martin. We cover racing, grassroots, history, we bench race, we talk life, and most importantly, we smash the loud pedal. It's time to turn some laps on the Mark Martin Podcast.
Episode number 26 of the Mark Martin Podcast, and we're going to go into the year 1985, back to the ASA days. But before we do that, make sure to hit our website, markmartinpod.com, markmartinpod.com, and also make sure to subscribe and listen on your favorite podcast player, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, and many more. You can find out that information on markmartinpod.com. But Mark, we're going to go back to 1985, and it's time to get back on the upswing. We're going back to the ASA days.
Yeah, climbing out of a hole for sure. So I'm going to kind of reach back into 84 and set the stage for 85. Arlene and I got married October 27th, Memphis, Tennessee at the Peabody Hotel. And of course the Wisconsin, the up north ASA race season was pretty much all closed up by then. So what we did is after the wedding, we packed up Arlene's station wagon and headed for Charlotte, where I still had my house from my failed NASCAR attempt 2 years earlier. And so Arlene and the four girls and I packed up in the station wagon and headed to Charlotte, and got the girls set up in school there in Charlotte. And I already knew that I was going to do the deal with Jerry Gunderman for 85, so I wasn't going to need to be in Beaver Dam anymore. So we headed to Charlotte and had a couple more races on the schedule. Thanksgiving, they had a race at Jefferson, Georgia. I didn't think anything of that, but Arlene, in hindsight, Arlene seems to think that was nuts to race on Thanksgiving. But that's how I made my living. So the girls, we all went to Jeffco and raced, and then we had the Snowball Derby. And then in January, we packed everything up, and we had rented a house in the Milwaukee area, so that I could go up there and work in the shop with Jimmy Pfennig and Jeffrey Pfennig and the Jerry Gunderman team. So we packed up our house, put it in a moving van, and like always, Arlene and I both are early birds, so we're never run late. So we left North Carolina, and of course we beat our furniture to Wisconsin. So we checked into the Holiday Inn. When we rolled in there, I had two vehicles. I had a van and had a Thunderbird, new Thunderbird. And so we went to bed that night and got up the next morning, and it was 30 below zero, 70 wind chill factor, 70 below. So that was the Southern girl Arlene Martin's initiation to Wisconsin. Now the kids didn't seem to mind it too bad. Neither of the vehicles would start because it was so cold. But pretty brutal awakening. So anyway, furniture finally gets there, and we get moved into our house, and I get started in the shop. We rekindle our relationship with Ray Dillon. Now, I don't know if Jerry paid for those chassis or not, but anyway, we built two new Dillon cars. Of course, prototype continued to do our Ford engines, and he was getting better with the new iron. 84 was his first year to build those Fords for us. So reliability was getting better and all that. We continued our affiliation with Ford Motor Company. Miller, of course, was the sponsor of Bobby Allison, and Jerry and Jimmy Pfennig and those guys had fielded Bobby's short track car for all the short track racing he'd done, with the Miller sponsorship. So it was just kind of natural for Miller to continue the sponsorship on my car as well and run for the ASA championship. So we fielded a car for all of Bobby's short track racing that he was doing, a Miller car, number 22. And then, of course, my car was the 2 car, the Miller High Life Thunderbird. And we got our stuff together to go run for the full schedule of ASA and all the ArtGo stuff that we could run and all the special events and everything. It was an incredible race team. Jimmy Pfennig, Jeffrey Pfennig. We had an enormous amount of volunteer help that would come in at night, but especially would come to the ASA races and help fit the car. So it was a big transition from 84 to 85. 84, it was a ragtag, very, very small group, just barely getting by to a really first-class organization, and a lot of help, very first class. Jerry Gunnerman did everything first class. And so we started getting our cars figured out, our new Dillon cars, and we had a really good year. We had some reliability issues and some bad luck, but we won 4 ASA races. We didn't win the championship. We lost too many points in situations, but and then we won a bunch of other races as well. That was a really, really, really good year for us. We made. I had, in some conversation with the guys at Ford, I had told them that I wanted to build a 358 cubic inch 302 block engine, which would have been, they said it would be 40 pounds lighter, because what it was, the 302 block was just a 351 block, pretty much just with an inch. Maybe it wasn't a whole inch, but I was under the impression it was an inch shorter deck height. So that was a lot of steel you shaved off of each side, a lot of weight. And I wanted to build a lighter weight engine. And so Ford, of course, had a very close relationship with Jack Roush and was supporting Jack Roush's road racing, which they were right in the middle of legendary road racing dominance and winning at this point in time in 1985. So they contracted Jack to build me that engine. So that was kind of my first chance to work with Jack. And we didn't work closely. He didn't come to any races or anything, but we did have some contact. He did do the engine. We did run the engine. It didn't turn out to be as light as what they said, and it didn't turn out to be as big an advantage as I had hoped it would be. I had hoped that it would be something like putting aluminum heads on a steel-headed small block engine. That was a big deal, but this didn't turn out to be so much. But anyway, it started a relationship with Jack Roush. We had a great year. We did we had a lot of fun. Jerry was a fun guy. And of course, Jimmy Pfennig was and his brother Jeffrey were fun, and all the guys, a lot of camaraderie. We worked hard. We put in a lot of hours at the shop. We'd work a lot of hours, but man, we had night stuff, and it was a really great year. I'm trying to think of any super big highlights. I can't really think of any monumental things. The year before in '84, we got our first ASA win since 1981. So that was a big deal after being gone NASCAR racing in '82 and '83, and started to get my feet under me. But '85 with Jerry and Jimmy and those guys was really, we were really on our feet. We really got up on our feet. We were really doing good. We had a great program going. As the season wound down, we knew what we were going to do for '86, the same thing, except that Jerry decided that he wanted to build a cup car. So we ordered a chassis from Banjo Matthews, rear steer car, and we had Robert G. Hang a body on it, and we went down there and worked in G's shop, helping him finish that off. So we spent some time there toward the end of the year getting that car ready. We were going to run 5 or 6 races. We were going to run the Daytona 500, I think a Talladega race, Atlanta, and we were going to run the road course at Riverside because I loved Riverside and had run 2 races out there in '82 and run really good in both of those with my car. Super underfunded, still ran awesome out there. So that was kind of our plan. So we added that to our stable along with just loving up on our cars. I don't think we replaced our cars, our ASA cars, for '86. I think we just showed them some real love and got them prepared for the following year. So Jerry also was in the trucking business, so he decided to get a big trailer and pull it with a big truck. We'd done 1985 with a cube van, and our guys didn't like that too awful much. They didn't think much of that, so Jerry built a tractor trailer rig for '86. So we spent more time building a cup rig, a cup car, and a new rig and all that stuff, and refurbishing our cars for '86, which was going to be a big year because we were better prepared. We'd been together for a year, and we had things in order, had things kind of figured out, had our cars figured out, and so we were sort of expanding. We were in a shop. Jerry liked Alan Quickie, so we had Jerry's shop was a big shop, had a wall in the middle of it, and Alan was on one side of the wall with his racing program, and of course we were on the other side. And so that was interesting because we were friendly competitors. We were definitely competitors. We were, at this time, Alan was really at probably the peak of his short track career, and he was just sort of preparing to go NASCAR racing during that time. So it was an interesting time having Alan for next door neighbor. It was pretty interesting having him in the same shop. Of course, he didn't use the same door, so we didn't see those guys a lot. Although we had a mezzanine that we had storage upstairs, and when you went up for the mezzanine, there was a little tiny hole that you could look and see over into Alan's shop. You couldn't see much, but you could see a little bit. So I had been known to peep, see what they were doing over there. But anyway, we had some good times. It was a good year. We won a bunch of poles. I think we won about 6 poles and 4 races and in ASA, and we won a number of other short track races, art golf shows and whatnot. Raced all over. So it was a good year.
So tell us about Jimmy Pfennig. I mean, that combination obviously was rocket strapped you guys. You both went and did big things. And in episode number 5, which was a live podcast at Mark Martin Ford last year, you guys talked a lot about ingenuity and different things that you guys were doing. I mean, you were doing some really trick stuff back in 1985.
Well, we were always looking for, there weren't any computers, there wasn't any simulation, there wasn't any, of all that stuff. You just, you thought stuff up and you tried it. And some of the stuff that you thought up was based on solid experience and knowledge. And some of it, you just dream it up and try it. You had no idea if it would work. One of the things that I learned through my years is that a lot of times, some of the time, you couldn't always predict, the outcome of new parts, pieces, setups, and those kind of things. Some of the stuff just, you just couldn't predict. And so we were constantly trying aero things. I wasn't happy with the aero on the Ford body, ASA body. Of course, it was new. It was in its second year, and it actually changed for 85, from 84 to 85. The nose changed, and I wasn't happy with that. And we did some testing, to try to figure out what would work better. And we learned some things. One of the things that we did was we put a full underpan underneath the front that made, with enormous amount of downforce, more downforce than you could ever use. You couldn't use it because you couldn't tie the back down. But we also ran a wicker across the back end of it, all the way across, and we put that wicker on a hinge, and we got a Peterbilt throttle cable, and we hooked that Peterbilt throttle cable to it, ran it up into the cockpit where I could adjust the angle of that wicker. And that way I could change how much downforce I had during the race in the front, and I could make the adjustments. And I know we did that. We won Kalamazoo, ASA race at Kalamazoo, 300 lapper with that. And I know by the end of the race, I had the wicker straight down so that it made no difference. It was probably making lift underneath there instead of front downforce, because we needed to tighten the car up. And so no rules against it, As we went along and did more testing, we found, that was not something that we improved on that, got rid of that and improved on the exterior part of the thing. And, I was never a fan of underbellies, did the underpans for years and years and years. And most of the time, they didn't drive as good as if you made the downforce on the exterior part of the body at that time. So we got rid of that, but that was just one of the things. We were always trying chassis geometry things and chassis things. One of the things that I had learned that I really, really, really did like, we ran 3-link rear suspensions, and I had learned usually we run the lower trailing arms level. That's the way we'd always run them since started running a How car in 77. The lower trailing arms were level, and the upper link you would run anywhere from level to downhill, probably 20 degrees, to make bite with that upper link. The only thing making that bite, it would also loosen the car up. It made bite going forward, but then when you let off, it took the rear tires out of this. So it was kind of limited on how much angle you could run there. But anyway, I found that running the trailing arms uphill 2 inches to the frame, put rear steer in the car, steer to right rear back, and also put a lot of forward bite in the car. I never really cared too much if the car was loose in. I never really tried to overly charge into the corner. My deal was all about getting wide open throttle before everybody else, because all the passes were not made going into the corners, they're made coming out of the corners. So that really worked out good for me. Ran the trailing arms uphill 2 inches to the frame, and the upper link downhill probably 15 degrees. Some rubber grommets in the in the upper link to cushion that a little bit. Steer the right rear back a little bit when the car rolled and body roll, whatnot. That combination really seemed to get us sailing. We got faster and faster and faster as we tweaked on that rear suspension and doing that kind of thing. But we're always looking at stuff, something new all the time.
So tell us about Wisconsin. Big year up there, 1985, not only for yourself, but there was some heavy hitters up there at that time. Kowicki, Rusty Wallace, Dick Trickle, all these guys. That's like the heyday at that time. Tell us about that scene in 1985.
Man, when you went to a race, ArtGo race or an ASA race, you had to deal with all the headliners, Bob Seneker and Mike Eddy and guys like that, Trickle. But you also had incredible racers like Joe Shear, Tom Refner, guys like Marv Marzovka, Jim Weber. I mean, there were just so many guys. Of course, Rich Bickle was really starting to come on strong at the time. There were so many guys that a lot of people have never heard of that were, they have never heard of, that were regulars up there and incredible racers. It was a really great place to learn how to race and sort of hone your craft. This was a time even still now, we're talking about 1985 and me working with Jimmy Pfennig. I still did my own tires and I still did the setups. I still I did the setups before we'd leave the shop every time. That was just those things controlled the handling of the car and were so important that I just would prefer to do them myself. Then if something didn't turn out well, I had no one to blame but myself. It's just so I was still doing the tires, still picking the tires out at the tire truck, and this was not these were not radial tires. They were Goodyear tires, and Goodyears were even tougher, much tougher to stagger, size, and put in sets than even Hoosiers are. Hoosiers were much easier. Of course, by this time it was a Goodyear tire rule most of the places we ran, or if we ran ArtGo, a lot of that was McCrary tire rule. So these were real challenges. Doing the tires was a real challenge. You would measure the tires at the tire truck, pick your tires based on dismounted tires, based on the sizes of the inner belly and the outer edges. You knew what stagger you wanted to run, and there was a lot of predicting what might come out as stagger. And then they grew a lot, and you had to know how to blow the tires up. Like my process was generally, pick the tires out, mount them, don't let them air them up. I aired them up. I would take the valve core out, air them up to the right sides up to 60 and down to 30, and 60 immediately down to 30, and 30 was qualifying air pressure. And then I would measure them at 30, And then the lefts, I would air up to 50 immediately down to 20 and measure them. And that would give me a pretty good sense. If I wasn't within a quarter of an inch of where I wanted to be for stagger, it wasn't going to happen with those tires. So I could move the right sides front to back or the left sides front to back. Or if I was doing multiple sets, I could, move set to set tires to get them to line up. And then sometimes I would have to get another extra right or extra left to get the sizes right. And then get them all in sets. For an ASA race, for example, 300 or 400 lapper, you'd have to have 4 sets or so. And, you'd have to have all of them set, the air pressures written on them, what the air pressures were supposed to be, because, you varied the left side air pressure to get the stagger that you wanted. So it was a complicated thing back then. The radial tire took all that guesswork and all that art. There was an art to it. Victor Getzloff, he was Trickle's, he did tires for Trickle. I mean, he was the master. I was really good at my tires. There were guys that were just masters at it. And there were other guys that would lose races because, their stagger would change. They'd want 2 1/4 inches of rear stagger. They'd start the race with 2 1/4 and they'd finish the race with 1 3/4 inches. And, they couldn't win with 1 3/4 inches, I mean, 1/8 of an inch of stagger back then made the difference between winning and losing for me. And that was about 2 pounds of air pressure on a left rear tire would change it about 1/8 of an inch. So you can imagine, how important that was and how you had to be on your game and had to know and be able to predict what those tires were going to do and when they got hot and got laps on them as far as sizing went.
So tell us about Ray Dillon. You got your relationship back together with him coming back. How did that come together? How did you guys work together after you came back to ASA?
Well, Ray and I never ceased being friends. He was bitter that I went NASCAR racing. And he was bitter that he got burned on that Busch car, where, he owned it. We built it in the second race. We totaled it. And, he was a little bitter about those things, but we were always friends. It's just that when I came back to him in '84, he told me the days of free cars were over. And so in '84, we built a Hanley car, just because I could, because I wasn't going to buy a car from him after being the primary partner with him in designing the car in the first place. So I don't remember what facilitated, us getting back in Ray's cars for '85, but Gunderman was probably already using Dillon cars. Or if he wasn't, after me being reestablished in '84, we had dialogue with Ray and managed to put his cars back together and on the racetrack. Well, I wasn't his, house car anymore. Things had changed. He was right. Things had changed and they'd changed forever. But we still had a great relationship, respect. And he was a huge player in my maturity and coming of age in racing. I mean, the time that he was a big influence on me. He was a grown up. I was a kid. He had big balls and I didn't yet. And he encouraged me to not be afraid of building and designing our own car and going out and taking the world, by storm. I'll never forget my relationship with Ray Dillon, but it did change.
Tell us about Wisconsin. I mean, obviously a shock in the new family, the cold weather. You lived in Wisconsin how long? I mean, did you enjoy it? Did you not enjoy it?
I didn't. I wasn't there to enjoy it. I was there because that's what I did to make a living. The girls never complained. We moved them from school to school. They never complained about it being cold. Arlene didn't like it. The people were quite different there. The culture was different there. It was freaking cold there. Tough, long winters. We were there in Milwaukee 2 years. And we'll get into 1986 in the next podcast and kind of go through that and all the building blocks. You know, we're building every year is a building block up until 82, and then the blocks all come crashing down. And in 84, we start with our first block again and start building, and now we're building. We've done 84, and now we're 85. We're building 86. We'll be building, and it'll continue to be interesting. 86 will be interesting. 87 will be really interesting. 88 will be, our first year with Jack Roush and be interesting. 89 will be really interesting because this is when we become really competitive and really contend for wins in a championship in our second season. And then, of course, 90 that's the legendary year where we scored more points than anyone else, but due to a penalty, we finished second. We didn't win the championship. So once we clear that hurdle of 1990, after that, there are only a few years that are really significant to me, and we'll get to that when we get to that. But we've got quite a bit of information and interesting years, building block years in front of us here. From where we're standing right now.
Tell us about Arlene. In retrospect, when you look back at this and you're like, you took 4 kids, you just got married, you took 4 kids, you moved them to Wisconsin, somewhere completely foreign to where they've ever been before. And look back on that, and how crazy does that sound right now?
Well, selfishly, it was crazy as hell for me, to think that I could do that and that this would work. Being 25 years old and marrying Arlene with 4 little girls, and me being broke and broken, spiritually broken, mentally broken, and trying to race cars for a living, especially short track cars. It's a very tough thing to do. But, Arlene is one of the smartest people I've ever known. And that was just not very smart of her and not very characteristic of her to marry me. I mean, it was just not very smart move. Because I was younger than she was. Of course, I didn't have any kids, which, I was very mature business-wise and racing-wise, but I had a hell of a lot of growing up to do on the personal side of things. And it was just a very unlikely situation. And it was, I was Arlene's third husband. I mean, this was, and I didn't have shit, but she waded right into it. I mean, she was damn hard to get to date me. She she held me at arm's length for a while and made me really work at getting next to her. But once I got next to her, that was kind of it. I mean, she just married me like she did, very much like I did, I guess. Just put blinders on, had blinders on. She didn't see all that stuff around us, and I'm sure her friends told her that she needed to think about it. I had friends tell me that I needed to think about what I was doing, and I was just like, I ain't thinking about it. All right, this is what I'm doing, and we just did it, and we went to Wisconsin. She didn't love it, but she didn't complain about it that much either. We were just digging. I mean, we were young, and we were fighting, to build a life, and it was a pretty incredible time. I just really, looking back on it, I really can't believe that, especially knowing her now. I mean, I can't believe she did it. I can't believe that she said, yes, I'll marry you, and yes, I'll follow you where your career goes. Wherever you go, we will go. And that was pretty incredible. But the sacrifice of the girls, Amy and Heather and Rachel and Stacy, was at the time sort of overlooked. I sort of didn't see that. But they were superstars in this thing, and real heroes, because they could have created tremendous hardship for Arlene and I. And and it would have been reasonable, but man, they just fell right in there. Moved to Charlotte, went to really, really rough, scary school at Charlotte. I was scared for them. And then we're only there 3 months and moved to Wisconsin. So that kind of winter, and all new people and everything again. I mean, it was hard. It had to be hard on them, but they just embraced it, and they are really, in my eyes, they're superstars.
Of all those tracks in Wisconsin that you raced for many years, what one was your favorite?
Slinger, my favorite. I loved Wisconsin International at Kaukauna. I loved that racetrack. A very odd shape. I ran really good there, but there's no racetrack like Slinger. Now, I really did love Anderson too, but Slinger is the number one. I'd just like to say this. Back then, we're talking about, 1980, 80 to, we're talking about running 11-second laps. Now, you hear that today, but back then that was unbelievable. 11-7, 11, first it was 11-9, then 8-7. And, one of the cool things I did was there was this one old racer that had an old car. It wasn't any good. He didn't have no money. His name was Greasy Keith because he was always dirty. And he of course, I always did chassis setups for anybody. He paid me $100 cash to come and set his car up. I did his setup for his car, set it up, bump steered it, the entire thing, got it right. Hell, he ran 1190. Nobody could believe it. Hell, he ran 1190 at Slinger. So it was unbelievable. But yeah, I of course I did. I went to Earnhardt's shop and set his car up, Dillon car up as well later on. But yeah, I did setups on the side. Anytime anybody wanted to pay me $100 cash, I'd come and do an entire setup for them. I did tons of those.
Last question we're going to have for 1985. It's a fan question that came in via the website, markmartinpod.com. They ask, how many years did Banjo stay with Mark? I remember him at Hendrick Motorsports on the Tide team for many years.
So Banjo came to work with me in late 77. Stayed with me through the accident in 1980 when my ankles and feet got broke. I got mad at him and fired him there, I think it was July or so of 1980. He came back to work for me when, for sure, I remember he came back to work for me when I had my own Busch Series team, Xfinity it's called now, in the early 90s, and worked for me then. And he worked at some teams, cup teams, at different times that I drove at, but things were different. When Banjo worked with me on my SA car, it was me, him, and one other person, and that really worked well. What happened was when I got into NASCAR and the teams got bigger and Banjo wasn't in control of things the way he wanted to be, he wasn't as happy. And so, I drove a lot of cup cars that he worked on for other teams, but our relationship was different then because we didn't run the show anymore. And so I hired him to work and run my Busch car in the early 90s. And then again, it was very similar to the way it was before because there was only 2 employees at that Busch shop. And so he worked with me for a while there. But, we were really in our zone when it was me, him, and one other person. We thrived off of each other. We inspired one another. We outworked one another. And we accomplished the things we accomplished on sheer time, hours, work, and it was amazing the things that we did at our young age, but things were different once we got into NASCAR, and it's just not the same environment, and so we didn't have the same kind of magic.
That'll do it for episode number 26, 1985 of the Mark Martin Podcast. Again, get on markmartinpod.com, markmartinpod.com, and listen to more episodes, and also catch us on all the various different players. Subscribe and give us that 5-star rating. Help us out. Get the word out on the Mark Martin Podcast.
Thank you for subscribing and listening to the Mark Martin Podcast. Remember to give us a 5-star rating in your app store. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Mark Martin POD. The Mark Martin Podcast is a production of the Accelerated Podcast Network.